Hello, everyone, and welcome to the TMA Ask the Expert podcast series. Today's session is entitled Understanding Clinical Trials in NMO and TM. My name is Roberta Pesci, and I'm the Research and Project Manager at the Transverse Myelitis Association. We are a nonprofit focused on support, education, and research of rare neuroimmune diseases. You can learn more about us on our website at myelitis.org. We're pleased that Sam Hughes from UT Southwestern Dallas, Texas, is joining us as our guest moderator for today. Before I turn it over to Sam, a few housekeeping pieces. This podcast is being recorded and will be made available on the TMA website at myelitis.org. And during the call, if you have any additional questions, please send them to us via our Facebook page at facebook.com/myelitis. Sam, could you start us off by introducing our speakers?
Sure. Thanks, Roberta. I'm honored to be guest hosting this podcast today, and I'm pleased to be joined by Drs. Benjamin Greenberg, Michael Levy, and Dean Wingerchuk. Dr. Greenberg is an associate professor at UT Southwestern Medical Center and is recognized internationally as an expert in rare autoimmune diseases of the central nervous system. He splits his clinical time between seeing both adult and pediatric patients. His research interests are in both the diagnosis and treatment of transverse myelitis, neuromyelitis optica, encephalitis, multiple sclerosis, and infections of the central nervous system. He has also led an effort to improve biorepository development and has created uniform protocols for sample handling and analysis. Dr. Levy specializes in taking care of patients with neuroimmunologic diseases at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, Maryland. In the laboratory, Dr. Levy's research focus is on the development of neural stem cells for regenerative therapy in these diseases. He uses rat and mouse models to test the survival, differentiation, and functional capacity of human neural stem cells to improve neurologic function in post-inflammatory conditions. The goal of his laboratory and clinical effort is to translate the basic science stem cell work to a human trial in transverse myelitis and other neuroimmunologic diseases. Dr. Wingerchuk is a member of the Division of Multiple Sclerosis and Autoimmune Neurology at the Mayo Clinic in Scottsdale, Arizona. His research interests involve the clinical behavior, natural history, and management of central nervous system inflammatory demyelinating diseases, especially neuromyelitis optica and multiple sclerosis, and also developing outcome measures for clinical trials. Dr. Wingerchuk and his colleagues have worked for more than a decade to better understand NMO through the development of new diagnostic criteria for the disease, which provide the basis for clinical diagnosis and research. Thank you to all of our expert panelists for joining us today. And thank you to all of our listeners for joining us and sending us your questions in advance. I will do my best to get through as many questions as we can today. To start off, I would ask our panelists, start with Dr. Greenberg, if you could give our listeners an overview of the type of clinical research that's going on in NMO and TM and issues with that and why it's important to have clinical trials.
Sure, Sam. Thanks for taking the lead on this, and obviously to the Transverse Myelitis Association for hosting the podcast, and to Mike and Dean. I'm sure today's going to be a fun conversation for a very important topic. Just as a way of overview into clinical trials, I think it's important for folks to have an understanding of the variety of clinical trials that exist in the world, because I think when most people imagine a clinical trial, they imagine having a procedure or a drug administered to them and then being followed over time. But that's not everything that's involved in clinical translational research. Some clinical trials that people are asked to take part in are surveys. Some clinical trials are examinations. Some clinical trials are interviews or collecting data from routine clinical visits. A lot of clinical trials do not change a person's clinical care or expose them to a certain drug. They are merely there to gather data so that we can get smarter in a uniform way. So I encourage people, when approached about clinical trials by their physicians or by researchers or by patient associations, to really look carefully, because a lot of times what we're asking for is relatively simple, but for rare diseases like transverse myelitis and neuromyelitis optica, we need everybody's involvement. Now, the traditional clinical trials, which involve exposing people to drugs or procedures, generally follow a 4-phase structure, phase 1, 2, 3, and 4. Phase 1 clinical trials are first in human, where the drug or procedure has been tested on animals and in a dish and looks to be safe, but at some point a group of humans have to be the first on Earth to take the drug or the treatment. And phase 2 is a larger number, which looks both at safety as well as get a hint on efficacy. Will the drug or intervention help people? And then phase 3 is the largest, looking very heavily at both efficacy and safety to determine, is the drug a worthy addition to our armamentarium for fighting a disease. And so when approached about a clinical trial, keeping track of whether it's a phase 1, 2, or 3 can give you a sense as to how much research has gone before relative to the drugs. For the rare disease we're talking about today, most of the trials we'll be discussing are phase 1 or phase 2 to 3. Phase 4 is after a drug's been approved, monitoring on the market to look for unforeseen events. And so as patients are hearing about clinical trials, I encourage them to remember that not all clinical trials involve interventions, and the ones that do split into those categories. Within transverse myelitis and neuromyelitis optica, there are studies ongoing throughout the United States that are both non-interventional, phase 1, and phase 2 and phase 3. There are some in NMO right now that have launched new treatments for the disease, and I'm sure we'll talk about them in detail as the call goes on.
Thank you, Dr. Greenberg. We'll go ahead and jump into some of the questions asked by the community. I do have to say there are some pretty well-informed questions. First, there's a question about the eculizumab trial, and one thing we might want to do is discuss the different trials in NMO that are currently recruiting or are being advertised. But this question asks about eculizumab. The projected end date of the eculizumab extended trial is currently identified as 2018. If successful through all the phases of research, how long does the process take before this would be available as a treatment option for appropriate patients? Dr. Levy, do you have any insight on that?
I do. So we are, at Johns Hopkins, we are participating in the Alexion eculizumab trial for NMO. And the way that works is it is a rolling enrollment, so they have to recruit a certain number of patients, I think 132 at the most. And as soon as a subject or patient relapses, they get moved into an open label arm where they're certain to get the drug and would stay on that drug until the end of the trial. And then after the trial is done, the company promises to continue providing the drug until the drug is approved if the study was beneficial. So for patients who do participate in the trial and have benefit from the drug, they'll be able to stay on it until it's FDA approved. For everyone who's watching the trial, it is expected to end in 2018, and then there is a review process by the FDA that could take months, sometimes a year or two, depending on how clear the data is, and then it would be approved after that. So it just depends on whether you participate in the trial or if you're just watching to see what the results are.
Thank you. Thank you for that clarification. Moving on, there's a question here also about NMO trials. Do any of you foresee a time when NMO research trials will include seronegative patients?
Yeah, I think, and I'd want Mike to comment as well, the majority of trials we are looking at, and some that are already listed on clinicaltrials.gov, will be recruiting both seropositive and seronegative patients. And so I think several of the drugs that are being explored will be used in seronegative patients.
And that's true except for the eculizumab trial. In the eculizumab trial, you have to test positive for the antibody.
Yes. So in light of the fact that there are no treatments for TM or NMO Is there anything being done to streamline or move the trials along in a quicker pace to bring something to the patients who don't have anything now to treat them, specifically maybe some symptomatic medications for pain, etc.?
Actually, yes. Because NMO is a rare disease, the FDA allows approval of a drug with just one phase 3 trial, the type of study that Dr. Greenberg was talking about. That's the large multi-center proof of efficacy trial. And you only need one for NMO to get potentially to get approval, as opposed to two big trials with most other diseases that are more common. So that's one way that the FDA has tried to fast-track medications for rare diseases. The second is that the FDA promises extra patent protection, or sort of a business incentive for companies to invest in drugs for rare diseases. So there is interest. I can tell everyone that pharmaceutical companies are interested in NMO. They are opening up their medicine cabinets, looking at different drugs, trying to find medications that are suitable, not just for the immunologic issues in NMO related to relapses, but for issues like pain and quality of life and muscle spasms. And we've dealt directly with pharmaceutical companies towards that end. So I think it's just a matter of time. So the answer is yes, absolutely, there are things being done.
Well, and that kind of moves on to a follow-up question that I think you, Dr. Levy, would be good to answer. There's a question about the Ampera trial that's being done, I believe in TM. Is there any results to report on, or can you speak to that?
I can tell everyone that it is a double-blind study, which means that I don't know when the patients are taking the drugs and when they're taking placebo. Everyone will take both, but I don't know when they're taking what. And so even though I see their walking speeds over time, I have no idea whether they're walking faster on the placebo or they're walking faster on the drug. And I won't know until the very end of the trial. We're about halfway recruited. And so at the very end, I will be unblinded. The pharmacy will tell me who's in what group, and then we'll be able to analyze the data and announce to the world, basically, does this drug help patients with TM, and how well does it work or it does not. So I can tell everyone that the study is going well. We're recruiting well. We could always use more people who can make it to Baltimore every 2 weeks for an examination. That's the catch. But it's going well, and we should be able to complete enrollment by the spring of 2015.
Good. You mentioned the blinding of the study and the placebo control. I think that can lead us into kind of a hot topic within these disease processes and drug trials, and the need for placebo control in some instances versus the concern for it, specifically in NMO trials. I wanted to bring up last year, kind of near the end of the year, the TMA sent out a survey to NMO and TM patients and their caregivers, and part of the crux of the survey was asking about willingness to participate in placebo-controlled drug trials and why or why not. And I went through some of that data, and specifically from the NMO patients, 35% said that they would participate in a placebo-controlled trial, 15% said they wouldn't, and 49% said that they weren't sure. This was about 100 or so NMO patients who said this, and I thought it was interesting to see the kind of half and half divide between those who were interested and those who weren't sure. And I was wondering if you all could speak to kind of that argument back and forth, the pros and cons of the placebo control, and where the conversation is right now.
Sure. No, Sam, this is Ben. This is, as you stated, this has been a topic that's received a lot of attention and had a lot of conversations around it. And I think the first thing that's important is for folks to have an understanding as to why at times controlled trials are needed and then placebo-controlled trials. So it turns out, as a species, human beings are not the most objective about our observations. If we have a turkey sandwich for lunch and then we feel sick in the afternoon, we assume it's the turkey sandwich. And the way science and medicine has developed when making very large recommendations to thousands or millions of people around the world is to ensure that when we make those recommendations, we do it with a modicum of rigor to ensure that we're not just charlatans, that we're not just saying, oh, you should do X because, and that we're honest when we know things and when we think we know things. And that's where controlled trials came in, because for many years as clinicians, we would recommend therapies based on our experience, which is incredibly important, but without data. And it turns out that while we are right more often than we are wrong sometimes. Our experience can be misleading. And so for a variety of reasons, the medical field moved to the notion of controlled trials in order to ensure both that something is safe and effective. We would have patients who would have a heart attack while taking Vioxx, and we would assume, oh, it was because they were a smoker or they had high cholesterol. And it was only when the data was looked at in a large setting that we realized, no, certain drugs were a risk factor for having a heart attack. We can do harm with the treatments we give. And so in NMO, we've been having the discussion about controlled trials, and I don't think there is complete consensus in the world. I think there are well-meaning, well-intentioned investigators who have differences of opinion on this issue, but the way things sit right now are that the initial trials in NMO will need a control arm, and in this case, a placebo arm. And the reason being, from our history, we've learned that there are times that our treatments do more harm than good. We assume, I went into medicine, Mike went into medicine to help patients. And we assume that when we make our best recommendation based on our experience or knowledge that we have, however limited, that we're doing it with the right intention to help a patient. I have to admit that there have been times my interventions have inadvertently done harm. Maybe somebody gets a serious infection with a certain drug or a complication. And the point of a placebo arm in a trial is to control, both for the safety and the efficacy, to ensure that the interventions we do have added value to the patient and patients as a whole at a population level. And so for a lot of folks who are wanting to prevent the next NMO attack, which is what we all want, the notion of possibly being in a trial in which they're on no drug is very concerning, and it's concerning to all of us. And I would start off by saying these placebo-controlled trials by no means will be for everybody. There are some patients in whom I would say, you know, you may not be the best candidate for one reason or another. But there are going to be some patients out there in the community for whom the trials are a good match and in whom they have a level of comfort entering the trial and will inform the rest of us. Clinical research is extremely difficult, and the brave individuals who take part in it, whether it's placebo-controlled or not, just the individuals who give of themselves to take part in this research get a lot of respect from myself, because it is a sacrifice on their part. And in the setting of placebo-controlled trials, it brings on a different level of concern, albeit I think a necessary one for at least the first drug. We are looking at a variety of creative ways to reduce the risk to each patient who takes part in those trials, but there is no such thing as a trial with zero risk. And we're trying to balance those issues, but it's been a tough conversation.
Yeah, Drs. Levy or
Yeah,
Wingerchuk, do you have anything to add or counter based on what Dr. Greenberg said?
Well, this is Dean Wingerchuk. I apologize. I'm a bit delayed getting on because of some technical difficulties, but I think Dr. Greenberg encapsulated a lot of the discussion very well. It's clear that there are pros and cons to a placebo-controlled design, and it depends a lot on one's perspective, whether you're a physician, scientist, or investigator who's interested in establishing beyond any reasonable doubt whether an intervention, a new medication, for example, works, but also how well it works, the magnitude of the effect, or perhaps whether you're a patient, a person with NMO, or maybe a family member who understandably would have some at least potential concern about the risks of ending up in a placebo group. And as he mentioned, there's a lot of discussion, and in fact, different study designs are already being implemented with different medications that take on these issues in different ways. So I think ultimately we are probably going to see a combination for the foreseeable future of trials, some of which incorporate placebo and some of which do not. The FDA, which ultimately in the United States regulates the approval of medications or therapeutic interventions, right now has quite a firm stand on the requirement for placebo controls in certain situations, and a number of investigators have been working with representatives at the FDA and other similar agencies throughout the world to discuss the pros and cons of that approach.
Yes, thank you for that clarification. So for some more clarification to our listeners, discussing the possible placebo control within these NMO trials, and understanding that every kind of trial has risk to it, are there special considerations being made within NMO trials to help mitigate that risk? I think that everybody's used to the multiple sclerosis trials where they look at annualized relapse rate and things of that nature. Are these NMO trials that could have a placebo control, are they going to be designed in that same vein, or are they going to look different than what we're used to?
So, Sam, they do look different, and I made a small reference to that, but it's important to go into detail. I think as a regulatory agency, the FDA has taken an extremely balanced approach to this. They have a job to do, which is to ensure they get interpretable data before putting the stamp of approval on a drug that it is safe and efficacious, and the placebo-controlled trial is scientifically the way to achieve that. But at the same time, they recognize the concerns and the unique patient population and that this is a rare disease. And there are two levels of accommodations, balanced accommodations being made. One of them occurs at the statutory level. So there are laws on the books that basically change the rules for rare diseases, including NMO. So normally, in a common disease, a company would have to show, or a sponsor would have to show, at least 2 phase 3 trials completed with convincing data for the FDA to consider approval. In rare diseases, there's only one trial, and it can be kind of a phase 2-3 trial. And so they lower the standard significantly around how many patients have to be enrolled and for how long. And that comes from law. But beyond the law, they've gone further to sit in a concerted effort with investigators and clinicians from around the country to discuss novel ways of doing these trials different from multiple sclerosis trials to try and add in extra protection. So, for example, in a multiple sclerosis trial, if you have a relapse, new event, you can keep going in the trial. They've agreed with NMO trials that the outcome will just be time to that first event for a small number of the patients. So once a certain number, and it might be even 20 or 25 patients, have had a relapse, which I know can sound like a lot, but it's not the hundreds or even thousands in an MS trial, it will achieve enough data to show that a drug is doing what it's supposed to do. They've also, in working with the investigators and with sponsors, put in guidelines for quick intervention at the clinician's discretion, whether it be steroids or plasma exchange or any of the treatments we use for an acute exacerbation. And then finally, I shouldn't say uniformly because there may be trials that are different, but the majority of trials that I am familiar with, if somebody has a relapse while on the placebo arm, they will be invited, similar to what Mike Levy was describing in the Alexion trial, to take part in what's called an open-label extension, where they will be offered the drug for free that they were not exposed to already, to see if that gives them better protection. And so there are a variety of things being done to try and limit the risk to patients, as well as offer as many advantages as possible to those who take part in the trial.
And Sam, if I could just add, this is Michael Levy. I think what we sort of have left out up to now is that the reason these NMO trials are different from MS is because of our concern that every relapse is more severe in NMO and could lead to permanent damage. So ethically, we're concerned about putting somebody on a placebo when we know that the relapse could result in permanent neurological damage. That's our fear. And even when we prescribe standard treatments to patients, we know there's a risk that it's going to fail. And so we sit face-to-face with these patients and we say, we think these are our best treatments so far, but we know that there's a risk that it might not work. When we enroll patients into trials, we want to have a similar conversation where we could say, we think these drug trials will help you, but there's also a risk you could end up in a placebo group, and that could result in a relapse with permanent damage. So it's the same kind of conversation, but when we roll in clinical trials, we want to find ways to reduce the risk of that type of relapse in NMO.
Yeah. Yes. Thank you all for that conversation. We're going to switch gears a little bit and move on to some questions regarding TM and research going on with TM. Specifically, there are some questions regarding remyelination and stem cells. And there's a question asking if you could speak on where the research stands in remyelination and cord lesions. The work on mice seemed miraculous, but is that definitive for repair, or where are we at?
So I'll just jump into this one. There are many different approaches to remyelination after an autoimmune attack of the spinal cord, and there are many different companies interested in pursuing treatments at a clinical level in a clinical trial. Some of those approaches are medicinal medications you can take. Some are more physical therapy-based, like functional electrical stimulation, and some are regeneration using stem cells and other approaches that stimulate stem cells that already live inside of your spinal cord. So there are many, many different approaches, and they're all being tested in rats and mice. In my lab at Johns Hopkins, we use both medications and stem cell regeneration models and have made a lot of progress. There's clearly evidence that stem cells can remyelinate. The trick is not that we can't make the cord remyelinate. The trick is really, how do we get the cells in there? How do we keep the cells alive? How do we keep a relapse from occurring after the cells are placed? And then how do we make the nerve function once it's remyelinated? So there's a lot of work to be done. I think that the rat and mouse studies are very important because they achieve a proof of concept that shows that these studies can be done. The very first trial will be a phase 1 safety study to demonstrate that these cells are safe. They don't form tumors or cause a relapse. And then there'll be future trials demonstrating efficacy. The very first stem cell trial launched in 2010, spinal cord injury, and since then there have been 3 others. So I think it's just a matter of time as the ball's rolling finally that a trial in TM will launch.
Thank you. And there's a follow-up question to that, kind of more more detail about stem cells, that they're presented as a new therapeutic approach. But in the case of autoimmune diseases, is there a risk that the cells could be considered foreign by our immune system and thus cause inflammation?
Absolutely. That's one of the biggest problems with transplanting embryonic or adult stem cells into a spinal cord, is that the host immune system, the patient's immune system, is going to recognize them as foreign and potentially could cause another attack of transverse myelitis. One of the ways we're trying to get around that is to use what's called inducible pluripotent stem cells, which is where we take patients' skin cells, take them back to the lab, transform them into embryonic stem cells, and then make neural stem cells out of them, so that when we transplant those back into the patient, they came from the patient's skin, and we know that the immune system is more likely to accept it. This is a new technology that's only been around since 2007 or so, but has really exploded in the field. Many different diseases are using this kind of approach for regeneration, and it really gets around a lot of different issues, including the risk of relapse from graft rejection.
Okay. And one of our listeners asked, would it be possible to do some kind of combined trial in both multiple sclerosis and TM, since a lot of the symptoms can be similar, or multiple sclerosis patients can have TM as part of their disease? And why would that not be able to work?
Well, I can offer my comments, and I'd be curious if Dean has a take on this. I think the issue with mixing trials for multiple sclerosis and transverse myelitis have to do with, first, obviously, what we're trying to achieve with the trial, but obviously in multiple sclerosis patients, while they may have transverse myelitis, quite often, if not always, they also have brain involvement, which our patients don't have in the same way, and that can make it hard to distinguish the outcomes data between patients who have both brain and spinal cord versus just spinal cord. The second issue is in multiple sclerosis patients, the inflammation can come back. The definition of multiple sclerosis is the multiple attacks. And in idiopathic transverse myelitis, this tends to be a one-time only event. And so if you had a trial that enrolled some people who during the trial had relapses and others who didn't, it can make the data a little difficult to interpret. Now that said, I'm sure there would be a way for certain drugs to do combined trials, but in general, I think the tendency would be to split these out.
Yeah, this is Dean. I would agree with what you've just said, Ben, and it's always a challenge to consider lumping together what are likely different conditions for a therapeutic trial, a treatment trial, when although there are similarities in symptoms and the structure that's affected, like the spinal cord and to some degree the underlying process, inflammation and perhaps demyelination, the mechanism of what exactly is going on in those different conditions may actually be quite separate, or there may be important differences that are relevant to the treatment. So if you lump them all together in a treatment trial, it can be challenging, if not impossible, to sort out whether there's a true generalized treatment effect or whether or not it's specific to just one of those disorders. So that would have to be something that was very, very carefully designed in advance.
Yes. So as a follow-up, this might be good for you, Dr. Greenberg. Is there a research center that wants the deceased bodies of persons who have had chronic TM for many years?
So that's a great question, and it highlights an important aspect of this, and that is the notion of doing autopsies on patients and getting tissue from patients who've passed away but want to make the gift of us studying their body, which is an incredible gift. A couple things just in general to be aware of. So one is for families and for individuals considering this, in general, autopsies do not hold up or change plans as people make plans for memorials and burials for our loved ones. An autopsy does not interfere with any of that. Almost always, as part of autopsies, the groups performing them cover costs associated with them and have arrangements and work with funeral homes and other places to make it a seamless process. And so it's an incredible gift that we really encourage people to look into. The challenge is, frankly, around timing. Once the human body passes away and blood isn't being pumped and oxygen isn't being pumped, there's a variety of changes that happen in the tissue that make our ability to learn from that tissue much more difficult. And in general, two of the folks in the country who've done a fair amount of this, one's at Mayo and one's at Johns Hopkins, Claudia Lucanetti at Mayo, a colleague of Dean's, and Carlos Pardo at Johns Hopkins with Mike. The numbers I hear from them are in the 6 to 8 hour range to be ideal, and then past 24 hours things get really tough. And so in general, arrangements have to be arranged and orchestrated ahead of time and not at the time of passing. That said, I know here at UT Southwestern we are in the process of gearing up our brain and spinal cord bank. And so in the future, I think we will be a active recipient of individuals who are willing to give this gift, but it would be regional for people who live close to us. I'll defer to my colleagues in Scottsdale and Baltimore if they have up and running programs that are actively seeking people. But in general, I encourage folks to talk with their university neurology groups that are near them, because in general it would be that group that would be the folks who could be recipients. Michael, are you guys actively looking?
Yeah, at Johns Hopkins we do have a rapid autopsy protocol. So if a patient is in the hospital and is in the process of dying, we do have a mechanism in place to transfer them to Baltimore as quickly as possible. They do tend to be East Coast people, but that doesn't mean that we don't want to consider others. So please, if you know anyone or considering, you don't live near Texas, then give us a call. We do have a protocol in place to try to make this happen. Again, as Dr. Greenberg said, it's a huge gift that really helps us learn a lot.
So there was one very specific question that I wanted to bring up. There are several organizations that are currently doing trials with ALS and traumatic spinal cord injury in this country and around the world. And one trial is going into phase 3 in the U.S., possibly in 2015. Might these drugs and these kinds of trials be effective for TM and NMO and our kinds of diseases?
Let me just jump into that. The answer is absolutely yes. We all learn from each other in areas of spinal cord injury, whether it was autoimmune or traumatic or otherwise, vascular, stroke. Studies like this of regeneration and recovery are helpful across fields. So we'll learn from ALS trials, and ALS trials will learn from our trials. They won't be specific. There's no guarantee that what happens in ALS can also happen in TM, but there'll be a lot of science underlying those recoveries and those trials that can be shared and understood and common. And so, for example, the stem cell trial that is now in phase 2 in ALS is informing how the stem cell trial in TM in phase 1 will be conducted. And so we definitely do share the science, even if it's not exactly the same disease. And that holds true for medications as well. Many of the NMO medications we use came from other diseases like myasthenia gravis and multiple sclerosis, and we learned from them and then applied them to NMO using rational judgment. And so the same will hold true for other trials like stem cell trials.
Do any of the other panelists have anything to add to that?
This is Dean. I think that was a good answer by Mike, very thorough answer. I think we see the precedence for that in not only NMO but multiple sclerosis as well, where current therapies have been applied to to other diseases before and after their approval for MS. So a very common scenario, and certainly in the realms of the things that Michael has a specific expertise in, like regeneration and repair, will probably be gleaning a lot of the leading edge information from studies that are initially focused on other disorders.
So there's been a lot of conversation, specifically in the NMO world, about new drug development to prevent relapses. But has there been many trials in the pipeline or currently happening looking at more symptomatic medications, not just for NMO but also for TM?
So I think in general the answer is yes and no. I think Mike, the trial he's doing in Baltimore with dalfampridine and walking speed is an example of a symptomatic medication trial, but I think it's actually one of the rare examples. In general, there has not been a large push to do targeted symptomatic trials in transverse myelitis or NMO because we have, in that instance, we do a lot of pulling from what happens in multiple sclerosis and spinal cord injury and other diseases. And the reason we can get away with it there is, and I'm more comfortable with it, is because once the spinal cord is damaged, whether it was from a idiopathic transverse myelitis attack, an NMO attack, or an MS attack, there's a lot of overlap to the type of damage that is there. It's not 100%, but enough where what we learn from spinal cord injury and multiple sclerosis symptomatically, I think in general, is useful and potentially applicable. And there'll be exceptions to that. And I think where the real need has been, because the biology of the acute attack and the relapses in transverse myelitis and NMO are distinct from MS and spinal cord injury, I think the focus has been to start there in terms of resources and to continue to just use data from other diseases for symptomatic management. Now, that said, of the trials that are occurring in NMO for prevention, at least one, if not two, of the drugs are independently looking at those drugs' ability to improve quality of life and reduce symptoms. And so I think this is gaining ground in terms of focused on symptom management and quality of life issues for our patients. But I think the number of dedicated symptomatic trials are still going to be small. And for right now, I think we can still use the data we get from other diseases.
Thank you for that clarification. We do have one live question from Facebook. I think this is going to be for you, Dr. Levy. And follow-up to your conversation about stem cell trials, do you have any idea when we might be able to expect stem cell trials to be occurring in humans with TM to start in Baltimore?
We were hoping to launch them this year, but that had to be delayed. We have cells that are FDA approved for ALS that we are going to test in transverse myelitis by a mechanism called neural bridging, where these neural stem cells will hopefully form a circuit that can bypass the lesion in TM. So we have the cells, we have FDA approval of the cells, we have the patient population, we have a very willing group of patients who really want to participate, and we have a design for phase 1 where the first 3 patients will be completely paralyzed with no symptoms, no sensation, no motor and movement, and no bowel bladder function, who will receive the cells at the level of their TM and then watched for a period of time to make sure that they don't get worse, that they don't have a relapse, they don't have a tumor, and so on. And then after that, we hope to get approval from the FDA to enroll patients who have very limited movement to see if we could improve on that, to see if there's any signal of efficacy. And it's just going to be 3 patients in that arm as well. So that's the initial design. We're hoping to participate with the NIH Clinical Center in Washington, D.C. at a subsidized rate to make the trial affordable. And we are seeking FDA guidance on issues related to immunotherapy. So again, this is going to be a neural stem cell graft in a patient with TM, and so how do we prevent the immune system from attacking the graft, making things worse? So those are the issues. We're working through every single one individually. The stem cell company is behind us, and Johns Hopkins is involved, and the NIH is interested, and so it's really just a process of getting everything lined up and getting the animal data as clear as possible for everyone to make a good decision on. And now we're hoping maybe in a year or so, but we're going to continue to work hard to try to make that happen as soon as possible.
Thank you for that, Dr. Levy. I would like to spend the end of the podcast, the next 10 to 15 minutes, if you all three could maybe discuss some of the current trials that are currently happening, recruiting, or soon to be recruiting for new drugs and NMO that are sponsored by pharmaceutical companies. If you might spend some time discussing what those are and what our listeners with NMO should take away from these upcoming trials. Maybe start with you, Dr. Greenberg.
Well, so I think there's a couple things to take away from the trials just in general. So one would be actually some excitement that these rare diseases are attracting the attention of biotech and pharmaceutical companies, and with it large investments of resources, and that's invaluable. There's no way private foundations or the NIH are going to solve these diseases. We absolutely have to partner up with industry to get the resources we need, and seeing their involvement I take as a very positive sign. Likewise, I think there is more we can do to make ourselves, our patient populations, more attractive to these types of investments. The longitudinal study we have going on here at UT Southwestern and versions of it at other places, at Mayo and Hopkins, are there to generate the data and through specimens, knowledge of biology of these diseases that will make our patient populations even more attractive to industry to invest hundreds of millions of dollars to make TM and NMO the focus of their research, and that's invaluable. So when looking at clinical trials, the trials that are done at all of our institutions, collecting data and specimens, even though it's a lot of time on your part to fill out surveys and answer emails and give blood, the patients are what hold the key to us attracting major investments from industry. When looking as an individual at intervention trials, I think the very first thing is to have a careful consultation with your treating physician to decide, is the trial right for you? And like I said, it'll be right for some and not others, and it's a very personal decision in terms of what's involved in the trial and whether or not you feel it's appropriate for you.
Dr. Levy, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, my feeling is that we've been working in the NMO field for many years now, and we have a body of experience that we've shared with each other, that we treat patients in a certain way, and we really try to make the best of what we have. And we've published on this and demonstrated that there are some medications that we think are helpful in NMO, even though they haven't gone through the rigor of a truly well-designed FDA placebo-controlled trial. We still have a sense that some medications work. And I sort of rely on a lot of that experience when I guide patients about making decisions to enroll in a clinical trial, where I say, let's try using these medications that we have a good sense that could work for you. And here are the risks related to that. And then consider the clinical trials and what their risks are, and weigh them against the known risks of the medications that we currently use, and then help the patient make a well-informed decision. And I think for the most part, I advise patients to try the good medications that we already know work. And if they fail, or if there are issues related to that, whether they're tolerability issues or unable to get the medication, then there are good considerations for clinical trials. But I generally advise patients who are new to NMO, try the medications that we think are very helpful first, but always keep in the back of your mind that there are these trials going on that could be important for medications for your future, or if things don't work out with the medications we currently use, maybe a trial is a good idea for you.
And Dr. Wingerchuk, do you have any thoughts?
Well, I think it's very exciting, of course, that there are a number of late phase 3 type clinical trials that have been launched in a short period of time in a rare disease. So that I think bodes well for the field and for people who are affected with the disease, because what it tells us is that we're reasonably far along in understanding the science. There's enough of a basis, a foundation of scientific evidence to, and also the clinical experience, as Dr. Levy was just alluding to bring out, to attract the interest, the scientific interest of people who want to try to dedicate their career to understanding the disease better. And just as, or more importantly, people who are interested in investing money, because it's going to take money to advance the science even further. I think although it's very exciting to see these trials occurring, it's even more important to make sure that the studies succeed. So there's nothing worse, well, almost nothing worse than than having a trial fail to actually enroll enough patients or subjects to properly answer the question in the first place. And that's why there's so much time and attention being paid by all of the investigators and everybody who's involved in design of these studies to try to make certain that they're successful. And then even if they are successful, it's important to realize that although the treatments that are being studied, say the leading treatments in the first handful of phase 3 trials are quite advanced scientifically and are quite exciting, they're probably not going to be cures. They're going to be first steps to understanding the most important mechanisms of the disease. And so we're hopeful that what we'll see is successful outcomes with, say, the first 3 randomized control trials that finish, and then to be able to go back and analyze those data in detail to find out, well, where should, given these results and given all of the scientific advances that will occur in parallel while these trials are ongoing, where should the next investments be made? Where should not only be investors putting their money and scientists be putting their attention, but if people with NMO are going to invest in the trials themselves personally, where should that happen? So this is probably going to be a long process, but again, we know a lot about this disease. I often tell patients that I see that we know a lot more about NMO scientifically than we do about multiple sclerosis, in my opinion. And so I think we're closer to that ultimate goal in some respects than we are for a lot of other autoimmune diseases.
Thank you all for that clarification and final thoughts on the trials that are happening in NMO. I wanted to let all of the listeners know that if they are interested in finding out what's happening in in clinical trials and NMO and TM and even other diseases, you can always go to clinicaltrials.gov. All companies who are running clinical trials and all sites who are participating have to be listed on there, and you can always search for neuromyelitis optica or transverse myelitis and see if there's a site near you that you would be interested in learning more about the study or what it means to be a part of the study. And lastly, I wanted to announce the Transverse Myelitis Association would like for me to announce that there's a symposium being held in Boston, Massachusetts that's sponsored by MedImmune, a biotechnology company. It's entitled Ethical Considerations Involved in a Placebo-Designed Clinical Trial in Neuromyelitis Optica. It's an interactive roundtable symposium. Dr. Greenberg, who's with us today, is going to be one of the panelists there. It should be interactive with patients also. So you can inquire into the TMA, the best way to be involved in that if you're free. It's on September 11th, 2014, that afternoon. I want to thank all of our panelists today for taking their time and sharing with us their expertise. I apologize for not getting to all of the questions that came from our community today. There are very many thoughtful and insightful questions, and look forward to the TMA's next podcast coming out next month. Please, there will be an announcement made soon for that, and please give us your questions, and we look forward to hearing from you all in the future. Thanks again, and everybody have a great weekend.
Thanks, Sam.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sam.